Here's a question. Is your aversion to risk potentially costing you a career? Do you feel failure? And do you fear failure? Do you have a lack of courage to speak up? Are you sort of stuck in the whole 9-to-5 routine and not really moving up the ranks? Now, of course, one of the things none of us want to do, and certainly hope if you're a bit older you're not in this position, where you've regretted the decisions that you did not make, or take a look back on your life and regret not having given it a go. It's a pretty broad brush stroke that we put across here. Emilio Di Stefano is a management consultant, an entrepreneur, and also a defence industry expert. Talk about all those strings to the bow. Maybe that's because he took a risk or two. Emilio, welcome along.
Good to be with you, Chris. Thanks very much.
Did you take a few risks in your life, mate?
I have taken a few, but I can't say that I started that way. I was brought up as a fairly conservative engineer, or that's what I trained in, and I was quite risk adverse for quite a long time there. But I learned quite along the way that taking risks really did pay off for me.
Yeah, I suppose it comes down to being able to take the risk, accept the failures and just carry on. I really find myself wondering, especially nowadays, Emilio, if people are really well equipped to do that.
Look, I don't think they are. I think if you look back at the way that previous generations were brought up, it was about stability. It was about, being loyal to a single job and all those things. There's a lot more, it's a lot harder these days to take risks if you look at the fact that if you get it wrong, the consequences can be larger in that it's out there for everybody to see through social media and various other avenues. So, look, it's not all, it's definitely not easier to take risks these days, but I think the more you do, the more rewards you can get.
Yeah, is there also more potential downsides to it? You mentioned stuff like social media and the fact that things people do can be very public. And let's face it, nowadays we've got so much virtue signalling, so much shaming, that perhaps people just think, well, the best way to be is to keep my head down and make sure and hopefully nobody will notice me. Because a lot of people perceive that being noticed could have a potential downside. There are people, for example, who want to be noticed and they see being noticed as being very positive and they make that work for them. They're also very good at handling the knockers. They can ignore people they see as being negative influences on their life the whole bit, whereas other people can find the whole process rather unsettling and rather unnerving. So how do you deal with it?
Yeah, well, I think one of the big issues there is that often it's those people that are closest to us that can be those knockers. It can be our friends, our family, our partners. And one of the ways in which to deal with that, I think, is just to surround yourself with a good core group of people that are actually supportive of you. People that, they won't kick you in the teeth when you do fall over or when you're down, but they actually give you a hand and help you back up. That can make all the difference because it's those people that will often push you to achieve greater things than you think are even possible for yourself.
Are some people better suited to taking risks than others, simply by the nature of their personality, for example?
Oh, look, there's no doubt. And if you look at what a lot of the research has suggested over the last, 30, 40 years, it talks about personality types. For example, if you're conscientious, you might be less willing to take risks than someone who's less conscientious, or if you're more open to new experiences, you might be more willing. But I don't believe that means that you can't develop that willingness to take risk because personalities are just a human behaviour, essentially. And like every other human behaviour, we can train ourselves. We can become better and strengthen the ability to actually take risks. And that's what new research is actually out there now to suggest that, a lot of people suggest that as you get older, your willingness to take risks basically disappears. But that's not actually the case. So the new research suggests that particularly in the early stages of your life as well as later in life, such as when you retire, your willingness to take risk actually changes quite significantly.
Yeah, I suppose, although I can understand, say, for example, if somebody's retired, they might be a tad risk averse because, let's say, for example, they don't want to lose everything in their twilight years because they know their ability to make it back could be somewhat limited. Whereas if you decide to go for it when you're in your early 20s, if it all blows up in your face, you've got your whole working life to make it back again. So I guess that risk by its very nature has different implications for different people depending on their circumstances.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. Depending on your life stage or the milestone, if you get married, for example, you may be less willing to take risks because you've got someone else to look out for. You might have kids to support, for example. But unfortunately, it is at those times, those types of times are often coinciding with what we refer to as the prime of our life. And it's often at that time that we've achieved, we've got the experience under our belt, we've developed the knowledge, and we have the networks, we know the people that we need to know to make real change or to affect real change. But at that time, we actually feel that we have the weight of the world on our shoulders, and it's at that time that we actually fail to take risk for the fear of failure.
See, at some point we talk about risk, but I would argue there is a word that needs to go in front of that, and that's called calculated risk. Because the last thing we'd want to do is take reckless risk unless you were somebody who had absolutely nothing to lose. And if it all blew up in your face and everything went south, there wouldn't be a problem. Unless you're in that situation, I don't know of too many people who would take anything other than a calculated risk. In other words, you believe it's got a reasonable chance of coming off, even though you accept that it still remains a risk nonetheless.
No, I totally agree with you, Chris. And I guess we are talking about calculated risk. So we're still weighing up the pros and the cons. We're still looking at both sides of the equation. But what I'm talking about is, there are so many people that only ever talk about doing something, but this is about taking action. This is about taking that next step.
What's the ideal time to do that? Because I'm getting the impression that you believe it's at the start of your working life and ideally at the end of your working life.
Oh, look, not necessarily. I think definitely if you do it
the reason why I'm saying that is because this is the impression I get, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm getting the impression from you that at the beginning of your working life, that's probably when you don't have responsibilities outside of yourself. And at the end of your working life, that's when your responsibilities have left home.
Yeah, and you'd be right there. In most cases, I think if we're generally speaking, I'd agree with that. You definitely have less responsibility as a youngster or as someone where the kids have left home, or, you may have some decent super and not have to worry too much anymore. But at the same time, during the periods of your life where you actually have a lot of responsibilities, you may be generating some good income, or you may actually have the networks at that period of time because of your role. You may actually be better set up at that time in your life to actually take a risk and have a better likelihood of it coming off.
When we talk about risk in this context, exactly what kind of risks are you talking about? Obviously, with stepping out and perhaps doing something in the commercial world for yourself, but for a lot of people, it can be a fairly daunting task. So how do you go about it in that calculated way?
Sure. So, look, when I talk about taking risks, these can be something as small as speaking up to your boss and telling them that you want a new opportunity or a new development opportunity. It can be something much larger, which is leaving your role, leaving your organisation, because so many people talk about the fact that they don't like waking up in the morning to go to their job, but yet 5 years later they're still doing the same thing. So there's lots of different types of risks that you can take. But I guess for me, there's ways in which you can ease your way into it. And if you are someone that doesn't like the uncomfortableness of taking a risk, you can start small. And that might be about doing something which basically takes you outside your comfort zone every day to build upon that. Because as we build upon it, over time, we become more comfortable with it and we build that self-confidence that's required to actually take more risks in the future.
Yeah, I suppose for a lot of people, it's actually taking that first step that becomes the major issue, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. It's always about taking that first step. I think once you take the first step, the rest of it kind of falls into place, or it should. And you've got momentum then. And provided that you're learning from what you're doing, then I don't see any issue with actually failing as a result of that risk, provided you haven't bet the farm on it. So we're talking about calculated risks.
Do you think a lot of people understand this, especially nowadays, because risk comes in so many different forms? I mean, even if we could look back at generation, things that are a risk now, perhaps then wouldn't have been considered a risk. There are, for example, at one stage, if you failed, you just dusted yourself off. Said, well, that didn't quite go to plan, did it? Maybe I need to go about this a different way. Whereas now we tend to have potential legal ramifications. There are other risks that people take. People can be held down for taking a risk. Somebody can be literally shamed for what they've done. And also at the same time, I don't know that we're actually teaching the current generation of young people to be risk takers.
And I'd agree with that. Unfortunately, I don't think we are. I think the schooling system is set up in a very risk-adverse way. We've created systems and we're trying to train people within those systems. It is a difficult thing because we're talking about, unfortunately, risk-taking is seen negatively in society. And as a society, I think we look down upon those that have failed, in Australia especially. Those that succeed, there is a bit of a tall poppy syndrome here, and that doesn't help. So I think one of the things we do need to be doing is supporting those who have got the courage to take risks and actually shining the light on them a little bit more and actually encouraging them for what they've done and putting it out there for others to see that if you do take risks, it can help.
Why is it here in Australia we seem to have so much of a problem with people taking a risk? And not only that, we almost seem to have a problem with people being successful outside of the sporting arena. In the sporting arena, especially in the sports that are popular, people generally speaking are fairly comfortable and they like having their heroes there. But we don't look, say, for example, somebody who's been successful in business. We don't view them the same way as, say, for example, somebody who's been successful in sport. They've both had success in their respective chosen professions, yet as a collective society, we view that success differently. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know if I have all the answers, but I can tell you from my time that I've spent overseas, and in particular in the US, it's a very different take on that. In fact, in the US, I remember I was over there doing some study and someone said to me, what are you doing over here? And I told them I was almost a bit concerned about telling them because I thought they might, look down upon me for it. But they actually said, oh, good for you, go for it type thing. It is a very different, way of looking at success. But in Australia, I almost feel like it's the battlers mentality where we all have to kind of be on the even playing field. If anybody's doing slightly better than the rest, we quickly want to pull them back down and all be seen to be, that at that average level together. I don't know what causes it, but thankfully I am seeing it change. In particular, the entrepreneurial scene and those that are successful, they're getting a lot more good stories, good news stories. So it is starting to change, but I'm not sure what's caused it.
Are we seeing a change in the general wider community towards that sort of stuff? It's something that's always struck me as being rather odd. And it's interesting that you use the US example because people in the US do hold success up as, well, hey, guess what? You can be that too. Whereas we don't tend to have that kind of mentality here.
Yeah.
And I've never been able to quite work out why.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it goes back to our roots. The Brits are a lot more conservative in general than the US or the Yankees. But I think the key there is that the Yankees or the US and the people there, they tend to want to learn from those that have been successful. So they cling on to them because they know that, well, if this person's made it, however you may define success, then maybe I can learn something from them and do it myself too. We haven't had that in Australia up until more recently. I'm starting to see it now, which is fantastic. And we're getting those people out there to talk about their stories. And more people are aspiring to do what they've done.
It's been a pleasure, Emilio. Thanks very much for having a chat to us.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Emilio Stefano is a management consultant, entrepreneur and defence industry expert. 92211 I don't know if it's anything that you've ever thought of. I have from time to time. Why is it, especially in the area of business and entrepreneurship, we seem to be rather uncomfortable with that here in Australia? We don't hold people who are successful in that area up in the same light that, say, for example, people in the United States do. We don't see it in the same way. Yet, oddly enough, if people achieve the pinnacle of a sporting career, for example, we'll hold them up and say, how good is this? Look at what this person's achieved. So why do we have these two opposing forces for the same? I mean, success is success, whatever your chosen field. But why do we, here in Australia, do you think, view success differently? Success in business is not viewed the same way as, say, for example, success in sport. There's got to be a reason. I just don't know what it is.